My name is C.D. Glenn. I'm the president and CEO of the U.S. African Development Foundation. Just as a quick background, ADF, a lot of you in the audience may know, but the African Development Foundation is a U.S. government agency founded about 30 plus years ago to invest directly in African-owned and operated enterprises. We focus on agriculture, off-grid energy, and youth-led entrepreneurship. So we're one of the government's only agency that focuses exclusively on Africa, and all of our grants and grant makings go directly to African-owned and operated enterprises operating primarily in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, and the Great Lakes region. Prior to coming on board to lead USADF a year ago, I was the Associate Director for the Africa region for the Rockefeller Foundation, and I ran the Global Agriculture and Food Security portfolio. So I know a little bit about agriculture, a lot about Africa, and really am excited today about this panel. I would say that we were probably making history today because I've been in international development for 20 plus years, and I can tell you, I don't think I've ever been on a panel around African agriculture with that, and the panel was consisted of three esteemed, illustrious women, no men on the panel. So to talk about the future of African agriculture and talk about engaging the diaspora, what better way than to bring women who are the backbone of African economies and also are the ones who basically do everything from the production to the post-harvest to the marketing, distribution of agricultural products. So very apropos for the Ron Brown African Affairs series and this panel to be dominated and led by women. So I think a round of applause for that. Today's discussion is the third year that we have used Feed the Future, the U.S. government's food security initiative, as the basis for our discussion. 2 years ago, our agenda included the leadership of government agencies responsible for the implementation of the initiative, in particular USAID and USDA senior staff who explained the composition of the initiative of Feed the Future and which were the primary countries that would be participating. We also had significant discussions on increasing the availability of food through new production technologies. Those of you who were around last year, we concentrated on nutrition. It included nutrition from the availability of more nutritious crops to the behavior changes necessary for the introduction and the use of those crops successfully. We also heard from global institutions last year like the World Food Program, WFP, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the Consultative Group for International Agriculture, CGIAR, as well as Where is Wanda, an NGO introducing nutrition to rural communities. So there was a demand for more Where is Wanda, and so we have Tamara Ray Stevenson here, who you'll hear more about later. This year we'll explore a very important topic, which is the role of African diaspora to contribute to the transformation that is both taking place and expected to increase in pace in Africa. This conversation will no doubt be dominated by the concept of partnerships, and I think that's what we're all here to hear more about, of how can we connect, how can we contribute, and how can we really be a part of the transformational change that's happening in Africa. And we'll also talk about an African diaspora strategy that should help us understand the potential for these partnerships to contribute to agricultural production, agricultural post-harvest, value chain activities, and nutrition. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists who will be sharing their backgrounds, their current activities, and more importantly, sharing with you ways in which the African diaspora can play a critical role in the transformation that's happening in African agriculture. So to my immediate left is Patricia Shake. Everyone, I mean, she's no stranger to this audience, so affectionately known as Pat. Pat Shake is an agricultural trade and development expert, and she's currently the agribusiness director at the Corporate Council on Africa. In this role, she's responsible for promoting agribusiness and investment between the United States and nations of Africa for CCA, the Corporate Council on Africa's member companies. Previously, Ms. Shake worked in the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. Pat served as the Deputy Administrator for the Office of Capacity Building and Development at USDA, In that capacity, she oversaw all global agricultural development and trade programs. She was also responsible for directing the U.S. foreign policy objectives as they related to foreign assistance, including food aid. She holds a BA in History and Political Science from Notre Dame of Maryland University, and an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Next, we have Heather Culp. Is that good? Heather is a dear friend. Heather is the executive director of the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, NDPI Foundation in Washington, D.C. The Niger Delta Partnership Initiative is a corporate social enterprise funded by Chevron that finds resources, builds partnerships, and improves institutional capacity in collaborative ways for combating poverty and conflict in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. Previously, she served as manager of public affairs for Chevron in Richmond, California, where she implemented a 5-year strategy designed to improve Chevron's reputation in the community while also helping to provide leadership around issues of economic development, education, and local jobs. She also previously served as community engagement advisor with Chevron's Community Engagement Initiative advisors groups, providing strategic support on community issues to business units across the globe. She was responsible for developing community investment strategies and the implementation of an enterprise-wide monitoring and evaluation system. I think this is really important because I think she had Chevron, she's been doing great work, but before that, she also had some fantastic work on the ground that she led. So prior to joining Chevron, Ms. Culp spent 10 years working in conflict management and community development and monitoring and evaluation. She served as the country director for Search for Common Ground's Angola office, where she designed, developed, and managed a multifaceted peace building and community development program. This program was recognized by USAID and the Department of State as an example of best practices in international development. And during her career, she's conducted field work in places such as Sierra Leone, Liberia, Burundi, East Timor, Ecuador, and Peru. So a global perspective as well as an Africa perspective from Heather. And obviously, last but not least on this panel is Ms. Tambra Ray Stevenson. She's the founder and CEO of WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. She's been featured by Food Tank. She's the founder of Native Soul Kitchen, and she's currently leading WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, to empower, really important work, women and girls to lead and create healthy communities in Africa and the diaspora. She was appointed by DC Mayor Bowser, and she serves on the DC Food Policy Council, and she's the author of the Where's Wanda book series featured on Voice of America and Forbes. We know where Wanda is today. The 2014 Nutrition Hero, she's a 2014 Nutrition Hero, named by Food and Nutrition Magazine, was featured as a National Geographic Traveler of the Year for her passion on finding her Fulani roots in Niger and Nigeria, which propelled her to promote the health of African heritage foods. Her work has been highlighted by the Washington Post, National Geographic Traveler magazine, She Leads Africa, Huffington Post, Cuisine Noir magazine, BellaNiger.com, and NBC4. She's spoken in Nigeria, Sweden, Ghana, South Africa, and Ethiopia on nutrition and health equity. She's a graduate of Oklahoma State and Tufts. And she is the mother of our VIP of the day, Miss Ruby. Ruby, can you stand up so everybody can see you? All right. So what we're going to do, we're expecting the ambassador to come and CFA President Mel Foote, but we want to get started, respect your time and the work that we want to talk about together. I think I want to start first with Pat. I mentioned that a lot of what we'll talk about today in terms of our goal is really to have a conversation to talk about a strategy for including policy recommendations on how to engage the African diaspora in African agriculture. That's sort of the end goal. But before we get there, let's just learn a little bit more about the organizations that we have here and the people. I gave some long-winded remarks, my own fault in terms of bios, but I wanted to give you that so that Pat and Heather and Tamara can give you the meat. That was just the appetizer. So you would know who's gonna speak to you. So why don't we start with Pat and talk a little bit, Pat, about CCA, the Corporate Council on Africa, your own rich history in agriculture development, and then a little bit about what CCA is what's new at CCA today, because I want you guys to learn a little bit about the organizations, and then we're going to come back around how to really engage the diaspora and really connect. So a little bit about Pat Shake and CCA.
Okay. Thank you, CD. Let me first start off giving you a little bit of history about the Corporate Council in Africa so you have some understanding. I know there are some in the audience that probably know a lot about the Corporate Council on Africa. I'll just call it CCA for short. It was created in 1993, and if you can think back during that time, Africa really wasn't on the radar screen for anyone, except for those that were interested in importing oil from a few countries in Africa. Other than that, no one was really paying attention to Africa. There may have been some development activities with regard to projects that USAID carried out, but by and large, the interest was very narrowly defined. So CCA was born out of this atmosphere where Africa really wasn't that important, but CCA had a wide range of companies that wanted to become involved, were either involved or wanted to become involved on the continent. Some of our companies are rather large companies, and naturally some of them are oil companies, like CD mentioned Chevron. Yes, Chevron is a member of CCA, but what you may not know, and Heather's sitting here to my immediate left, is that Chevron does get involved in agricultural projects, the Niger Delta being one area in Africa. And when they do that, they do look at the diaspora and the local people, and they also look to CCA to see if they can identify folks that could work on their projects. So some of these large companies that you may not think of because their primary mandate is one thing, they may be involved in a cross-section of sectors like agriculture and health, because they realize that the economic stability of a country and having healthy workers is very, very important. So CCA has about 150 plus members. They range in size from large, medium to small companies. Some are African companies. An increasing share are African companies. We have about 20% of our membership that is African, so we're very proud of that, and that number is growing. I came to CCA for having a background in international trade, primarily China and East Asia. So it was at a time in the 80s that was really, I think, beneficial to have that background in Asia, especially China, because I saw the transformation of that country, and I also sat down at the negotiating table with China in terms of agricultural trade issues. So I have a fairly good understanding of what China and India are doing in Africa, and so I think it adds to our portfolio because they're such major players on the continent. Some of the new initiatives that we've become involved with at CCA is the area of tourism, increasingly important area for Africa. Area that's often overlooked. Most people just look at South Africa and say, that's where they're going in terms of vacation. They may think about Kenya, but there are other countries that also have a very good opportunity to expand their tourism portfolio. And we see increasingly people wanting to go to countries like Ethiopia that has a lot of historical sites that are world-renowned, and in other areas. And then we see new other countries that want to become involved in Africa, on the continent, that want to become involved in the tourism sector. We are also looking more closely at, because of the sort of the climate here in the U.S., we're also looking at more so at the state level in terms of businesses, because these are where the businesses are located in our country. And so we're looking to strengthen our relationship with the states. We went on an exploratory trip with folks from Nevada to South Africa and Namibia, and now the governor of Nevada is the head of the National Governors Association, so that should bode well, and he's very much interested in Africa. So you have a lot of states now that are very, very interested in Africa. We've worked very closely with the North Dakota folks. North Dakota folks who are interested in Africa, and also the folks from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Atlanta, and from Georgia, Atlanta in particular. So there are quite a number of states that are interested in the trade of Africa, trading in Africa, and we're looking at that opportunity. We're also looking at working more closely with foundations such as the Rockefeller Foundation, and we had started that initiative in February of 2016 because the Rockefeller Foundation has what they're calling their Yield-Wise program to reduce post-harvest losses. Many of you may not know that there is about 30% on average crop losses in Africa that are preventable, that could add to food security, and we're all talking about 2050 and the increase in the world population. So some of what is being lost on the ground can be prevented. We're also looking at universities that have new science and technology applications and some newer industries that people wouldn't normally think of. For example, in our recent summit, we partnered with Hello Tractor, a company that is in Nigeria and has moved away from the actual hardware to software applications of these small tractors that have more applicability in Africa. So those are just a few of our initiatives, but I welcome a deeper conversation with you with regard to the activities we're involved in. Thanks.
Thank you, Pat. That's excellent. And we've been joined by Her Excellency, the Permanent Representative to the U.S. from the African Union. And Madam, what we've been discussing thus far is just an intro to talk about how the diaspora can connect, can potentially contribute and collaborate with initiatives around agriculture on the continent. And we have represented here the Corporate Council on Africa, the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, and an organization called WANDA, the Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. So what we're in the opening stages, but ultimately what we're going to be talking about today is how a organization that engages corporations, how we talk about community and country engagement, and then actual individual lives, and so how the diaspora can, again, connect, contribute, and really collaborate to advance African agriculture. You're welcome.
Let me just take this opportunity to welcome you all. For those of you who were not here earlier today, welcome to the Africa House. I'm Ambassador Chiombo Kwao. In my previous life, I was a medical doctor until about 9 months ago. And I remember when I was trying to make a decision as to whether or not I should come to Washington or stay at home and continue to do what I have done in the past 26 years. My husband looked at me and said, you're being given an opportunity to do something about what is wrong with Africa. And he said, if you don't take this opportunity, I don't ever want to hear you complain again about what is wrong with Africa. So it was at that moment that I then decided, okay, maybe I'll give it a shot. When Chairman Zuma swore me in, the last thing she said to me, she also was looking for a diaspora. There were other individuals within the African Union community, as well as just the diplomatic community in Africa in general. She said she did not want to get somebody from within. She wanted to get a diaspora. Why? Because she realized that for change to come to Africa, it's going to need significant participation by the diaspora. And so she felt she needed to get somebody who is a diaspora and understands the diaspora, for the diaspora are central to the development of Africa. It is along those lines then that I'm here. The African Union is made up of 55 countries. They meet twice a year, the leaders, to discuss the issues pertaining to Africa and charter the way forward for the development of Africa. Central to conversations currently, regional as well as continental integration. Why? Because the leaders are finally coming back from 1963 when Kwame Nkrumah said, Africa for the Africans and African Union now. It's taken us up to now to begin to realize that It is only through Africa speaking with one voice that Africa can move forward. That 55 voices are chatter and not music. That Africa needs to come together and give the world the best melody the world has ever heard. And that means us speaking with one voice as one Africa. It is along those lines that we also look and say the richest continent on earth continues to be the poorest continent. Why? Because we are not united. Coming to the discussion that we are dealing with now, which is the issue of agriculture. It is estimated that by 2030, Africa could easily be the breadbasket of the world. We have everything it takes to be the leader of the world, from mineral resources, just endless abundance of natural resources, and of course, fertile land. Talking about fertile land, again, with all the land that we have, there's still hungry people in Africa. It takes me back again to the diaspora and say, we have everything we need to take care of ourselves as Africans. Why aren't we feeding ourselves? Why aren't we growing enough to feed ourselves? And all of it goes back to us not being organized, us still continuing to go through life with a colonized mind, thinking of me, and not we. Mm-hmm. It's about us. It's about our sheer survival. The African ship, as we know it, it's sinking. And if we don't come together as Africans, we are going to sink. That's if we haven't already sunk. A few years back, I understand Becky got into trouble because he made a comment about the most common cause of death in Africa was, the comment was HIV is not the most common cause of death in Africa. And I think he got into trouble because of that. Or rather, HIV was not the most common cause of AIDS in Africa. I think that was the comment. Mm-hmm. HIV was not the most common cause of AIDS. To a layman person, it's like, well, that's wrong. But let's stop for a moment. What does AIDS mean? AIDS, autoimmune deficiency syndrome. Anything that weakens your immune system to a level that your body is no longer able to do what it needs to do to protect you. Because innately we have our own defense mechanisms that come up to action whenever anything offensive comes your way, internally or outside. So let's go back to that AIDS, autoimmune deficiency syndrome. Let's take malnutrition in Africa and put it here. And then let's take HIV and put it here. I'm sure we will all agree that there are more people suffering from malnutrition in Africa than are suffering from HIV. So then what is the most common cause of AIDS in Africa? So Mbeki was right. His PR people just didn't do a good job of explaining what he was trying to say. That we need to put the same emphasis we put into HIV campaign as we should in malnutrition in Africa. If we truly want to address the issues of disease, death, and suffering in Africa, where we really need to go is to the beginning, and it goes to nutrition, which is what makes this platform today a very important one. Agriculture, nutrition is at the core of the humanity. It's at the core of each and every African. It's a very important topic, and I hope that by the end of this session, we'll come up with outcomes and recommendations and solutions that we can all rally on to address the issue of malnutrition, disease, and death, all because we are letting our agriculture go down the tube. Welcome to the Africa House.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Very inspiring words and wisdom for all of us to think through this panel, but also to take with us long after we've gone from this place. Thank you for that. Let's continue the discussion as we've discussed some level of engagement around corporations through the Corporate Council on Africa. Another key ingredient to transforming African agriculture, but also engaging the diaspora's relationships that we'll have, that organizations have, and partners they have with countries. So one such initiative is led by the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, and we've invited Heather Culp here to share with you this initiative, but also to share a little bit more about how Chevron and the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative engages communities. Corporations are a key component in a partnership for diaspora engagement, but also communities, and so and in various countries. And so, Heather, why don't you share with us a little bit about the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative and your work?
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this amazing event here. We really appreciate the opportunity to exchange ideas, and I certainly hope I'm here to learn as much as to share a few things that we've learned along the way. NDPI, as CD said, was founded by Chevron with some seed funding 7 years ago to really look at the root causes of instability and poverty in the Niger Delta. And one of the things, after a lot of data analysis, and we looked at what would be one of the ways that you could most make an impact on employment in the Niger Delta. And agriculture came up as really having the biggest potential for absorbing so many of the youth that currently need economic opportunities and remain at risk for militancy and violence in the Delta. And so that's why the corporation decided to create an independent foundation that would then create partnerships to do just that. And so partnerships obviously is part of our name, and that's for good reason. We partner with over 500 organizations in Nigeria. Most of them are Nigerian, but we also have co-financing relationships with USAID, with DFID, with UNICEF, as well as with a lot of private sector partners. And we really take a market-based approach to agriculture. There's been a lot of training. There's been a lot of discussion and giving of technology and seeds, but a lot of those projects haven't actually created sustainable changes in agriculture. And when you're looking at a place like the Delta, so we talk a lot about Africa being potentially the breadbasket of the world, there's a more immediate challenge, right, which is Africa feeding itself. The Niger Delta has 32 million people already. The median age right now is 18. That population is expected to grow exponentially within the next 10 years. And with lower oil prices, as we've seen, it's more expensive to import food. So you're looking at a place where you actually have an incredible amount of opportunity for self-sufficiency. And hopefully then, once you get to self-sufficiency, then you're able to start thinking about exporting, right? So we're really looking at how do you look at the market inefficiencies that are holding agriculture in a place like the Delta behind? And we really work in 4 different value chains, in 4 different sectors. So aquaculture, fish farming, palm oil, cassava, and then business services and appropriate technology. Those 3 sectors within kind of the enabling sector behind it were really chosen because, one, the Niger Delta has particular, where it's located, aquaculture, for example, it has a particular advantage there for that. It also has the ability to absorb a lot of economic opportunity and create a lot of jobs. And so we look at those and we make partnerships primarily with the private sector to say, right, for instance, with aquaculture, Niger Delta catfish, even though there's an extraordinarily large market for catfish in Lagos, for instance, Niger Delta catfish was looked as not being of good enough quality. Why? So we looked at that, and we partnered with fish feed companies in the private sector who looked at the ponds, who looked at our farmer collectives and said, well, they're not using biomass feeding techniques. And the farmer said, well, okay, so what is that? So we created demonstration ponds. Now, I want to be clear that nobody gets paid to do any of this, because I think that's been one of the biggest problems with sustainability, is that you create training programs, you pay people to attend, and oftentimes what you see then is after the payments stop, the actual innovations don't get spread. Instead, what we did is we took that private sector approach and we said, what is the incentive for a fish feed company to start working with farmers? Well, it's obvious. Sell more fish feed, right? Farmers aren't buying enough fish feed because they don't think it's necessary. Or they buy a lot at the beginning of the life cycle, and then they run out of money, and then their fish suffer, and so they have smaller quality fish, so they get a lower price at market, and you have an uneven customer base for your fish feed. So we brought in the private sector fish feed companies to create demonstration ponds to show the farmers through the life cycle of catfish how to use biomass fish feeding techniques, right? How to apply the appropriate amount of feed, how to get a larger yield. And at the end of that demonstration, of course, the fish were much healthier, they were much larger, they got a better price at market, the farmers made more profit. What did they do with that profit? They went and they bought more fish feed, right? And so it creates, it helps to address a market inefficiency that benefits both sides of the chain, right? Both supply and demand. Then we also looked at how could you get the farmers to get even more income for those fish? Well, if they actually smoked the fish and sold them at market as a smoked product, so now we're talking like we're going up one more level of the chain, they get a better market price, right? So it's figuring out how do you increase yields, how do you increase incomes, and then how do you create platforms for our farmers and our private sector partners to share those lessons and diffuse those ideas. CD talked about one of the things that I've been interested in my career is monitoring and evaluation. And one of the things that we're looking at is how do you measure the diffusion of ideas? How do you start to say, all right, we've worked with 200 farmers. At what point do those 200 farmers start to share the innovations that we've shared with 200 more farmers? What does it take to create that? So a lot of our work is creating platforms and figuring out ways to diffuse the ideas beyond just that initial demonstration plot, right? So again, it's really looking at what are the incentives for the participants in the market and how do you create new incentives or use those incentives to create higher yields, larger incomes. And what does that do in terms of my earlier point about needing to absorb a lot more people into the market? It creates opportunities for new people to crowd into the market, right? And that's what we're starting to see. So you look at, for instance, in Nigeria with the devaluation of the naira, right now, imported rice is very expensive in the market, right? So more people are starting to look at supplementing imported rice with local gari, right, from cassava. So there's now an opportunity to create more of a market. And a lot of what we're doing now, for instance, in the cassava is, okay, we've spent now 3 years introducing seedlings through some of our partnerships that have better quality cassava. Now we're starting to partner with some of these large agriculture processing plants who traditionally would use imported flour, but now need local flour because they can't afford the imported. So again, it's looking at ways to create partnerships, to create platforms, to look at how our farmers can use the incentives that exist in a market system and work within those incentives to create more capacity. It's really exciting. We're learning a lot. I can't say that everything we've piloted has worked, but I think for me what's so exciting is this notion that it's done in partnership, right? And so what we're learning is being shared with USAID. It's being shared with government ministries and local governors. It's being shared with DFID. And it's figuring out how you can use the power of those community platforms to diffuse these new ideas. So for me, agriculture in a place like the Niger Delta is just an incredibly powerful sector that is really exciting. And I think given where we are, both economically on the continent and even with some of the recent shocks, it also poses some incredible opportunities, right, for investment. So to me, it's been such an honor to work on something like the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, to really see how looking at ways to work through community platforms, through community networks, linking those networks through the private sector can really have some tangible outcomes for farmers.
Fascinating, Heather. And I mean, you hit on a number of things that resonate, I think, with all of us, and that dovetail nicely to what Pat shared in terms of the Corporate Council on Africa being sort of a platform for companies to engage in Africa in new ways, and them being having the stakeholder engagement to engage them. And then you take it down to the community level and really empowering local communities to come up with solutions for themselves, not a pay to play, hey, we'll pay you to do this or do that, and when we walk away, you stop acting, that they really have local ownership and you build that local capacity. And then, you know, going off of Her Excellency's remarks around the timing, her own timing of coming here 9 months ago to lead this auspicious organization and representation here in the U.S., and the timing that you said, that there's things that are happening now in local communities that could not have happened before, but the timing now to not only to demonstrate them, but to scale them. I mean, I wrote that down, to really be able to measure the diffusion of ideas. And that diffusion of ideas really comes one by one, everyone in this audience hearing what's possible or seeing what's possible and then taking it forward. And someone who's done that for a number of years is Tamara Ray Stevenson, who really is on the empowerment of people, who her life's work is around creating sheroes and really looking at these issues at an individual level. If we had a CCA, the Corporate Council on Africa, doing it on the corporate level, if we had the Niger Delta Partnership looking at it at a regional level, how do we help it? How do we do this on an individual level? And the empowerment of women and girls, I think everyone in this room knows that's essential to all of our work. So Tamara, why don't you talk a little bit about Wanda and what you've been doing and how you've been transforming communities, but also transforming individual lives to help them really look at agriculture and dietetics and nutrition. Thanks.
Well, thank you again to Melvin, to Her Excellency for having us here today. So we know perhaps the World Health Organization has projected 42 million Africans will have diabetes by 2030. We may not necessarily see the straight connection that agriculture plays in that, but having had the opportunity to have grown up in an African diasporan household with a stepfather from Ghana, visiting the family house, having gone to Cape Coast and speaking to the medical school dean there about how are we equipping a new generation of food sheroes who understand this connection, that our land, our agriculture has a connection directly to our health, and how is Western foods displacing local foods, and who will be that brand mascot and change that narrative and imagery. And so I've created Little Wanda. Part of my background in training is nutrition and dietetics, as well as public health communication from Tufts Medical and Emerson College. And it equipped me with this skill set of understanding that edutainment is a powerful way of engaging this generation, like my daughter, who's loves YouTube and programs that are kids that look like her, and that was part of the motivation of creating this new character where her superpower is African foods, and how she uses her magic apron to travel across Africa to meet with what we call big Wandas, who are farmers who are making a difference in their local communities. So in the first book that we created, crowdfunded last year, Where's Wanda, we traveled to northern Nigeria, where we meet with Mrs. Garba, who I call her the Wangari Maathai of northern Nigeria, who is producing made in Nigeria rice. And she is operating a women farmers co-op where they have childcare centers, they're doing political empowerment, they're creating economic opportunities for men and women, but women play a chief role. And she is just a countless example of what we call the hidden figures in the food systems that we honor through our Wanda Awards that we put on in March. And that's an opportunity to highlight those who have not been highlighted for so long, and to know that girls need to know women like Mrs. Garba are out there, and they need to know those stories and those narratives. And so I partly use my platform to not only create content, but curate these products and experiences to where, how do we start changing the narrative? So the book series that we see is the start of creating a bilingual Pan-African series where little Wanda is the star, and she learns how to combat NCDs like diabetes, and next, how does she travel to Kenya and learn Swahili and combating heart disease, and how our local foods have a direct role in that. And I say this because when we talk about agriculture, it can be very general. That can mean so much. I grew up in Oklahoma. I was a Future Farmers of America card-carrying member. Agriculture was chiefly livestock, very similar to northern Nigeria. And so I don't think there was a coincidence that where I landed in Oklahoma and going back to my roots, finding so many commonalities, that it was time to come back. And to give, and that is the role of the diaspora, is to making these strong linkages that when an environment does not truly value your skill set, how can you go back to a place that you can make an impact? I chose to look within, and as in the first book, we share Wanda wisdoms in every book, and the first one we share is all I need is already within, and that means within my foodways, within my heritage, within my divine feminine power, something that I did not necessarily fully embrace or see growing up back home in Oklahoma, but I knew that once I began traveling and had the opportunity to speak at the EU Summit, part of the delegation of young African leaders, and being able to speak to students in Ghana and to Nigeria at Kano Teaching Hospital, and to speak in South Africa at University of Pretoria when the Fees Must Fall protests happened. It was a moment where I realized that I have something within me that I can give back that I didn't necessarily see here. And so in terms of policy opportunities that we see, having worked in federal and local government, is that I realized data equals dollars. And some of the data that's currently missing right now is that as we create a platform around Wanda, we realize that we don't really know the number of nutritionists or the number of women who are in leadership positions in the food system. We know how many farmers, but that's kind of like worker bee population. We don't really know who are decision makers and key drivers of change. And that creates a data gap for us. We're able to tell you that there are less than 3% of people of African descent in the field of nutrition dietetics in the States. We can't tell you that number for Africa. And I can say that because my mentor is president of the African Nutrition Society, and he doesn't have that data. It's a gap. And when you don't have that data, you can't build human capacity. And when you can't build human capacity, you can't really create the food freedom fighters on the front line that we need, like little Wanda. The other data gap that's happening, when I surveyed and went to medical schools, like in Nigeria and other places, and even the hospitals, documentation is not happening. You can go to a hospital here and you can find what we call the nutrition care process manual. So if you have an issue of diabetes, heart disease, you can flip pull a chart, you can create a diet plan for that person. So in Abuja, for instance, the nutritionist would say that she gets lots of calls about diabetes, very few calls about malnutrition like pediatric cases. And so with that, she's compounded with challenges. She's only one person. There's typically 3 dietitians per hospital on average. They don't have anything documented, so it's very old school, just imagine 50 years ago. And then the question raises, who's going to start documenting the value of African foods? How are you going to create user-friendly mobile applications around that? How are you going to create textbooks around that? Most schools are currently using information that's coming out of India, out of the UK, out of the US, and there are no books. Like, you can literally go on Amazon.com and find Chinese nutrition dietetics books. Okay, why can't you find one for Nigeria, for Ghana, let alone the whole continent? That's a problem. So you can't teach someone to say your health has a direct connection to your food and agriculture if the information isn't even shared. And the diaspora plays a key role, and the part of how I began to recognize that, I was served as an extension agent. I went to land-grant universities. I value land-grant universities. And through that, the domestic policy is equally as important in this conversation as foreign policy. For instance, we had a conversation at one USDA conference, and it was on the issue of creating an ethnic food database. The conversation focused around Latin foods, Asian foods. No one brought up African foods. Why? Because there was an assumption that we're all monolithic. Therefore, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. And therefore, even though we had people like me who were in the room, I could distinctly tell there was a Nigerian in the room at the table with me, but no one spoke up. And so I put out on the listserv, does anyone on the group have a population that is of African descent that may need to know the value of African foods? Rutgers said yes. University of Maryland said yes. So the question is, why is this information not being captured? We can blame institutionalized racism. We can call it a lot of different things. And therefore, until we start changing and being the advocates here, just here in the U.S. alone, that has the resources to say, hey, USDA, NIH, you have a 5-year research agenda. Why are you dedicating that to studying Alaskan Inuit native foods, which represents maybe 0.001% of the population, but you can invest on the foods of the African diaspora that are fully present and contributing voters and economic power and political power, and there's this global community that's formed, and we make a direct supply-demand impact with the continent. So, for instance, in the book we highlight Hassa hibiscus. We name all the foods various characters. Baba Baobao, you meet Mamadou millet. Partly of that is recognizing that when we think about the narrative of Africa, it's talked about in ways around animals. Part of the National Academy of Sciences, if you research the Lost Crops of Africa, Volume 1, 2, and 3, they talk about the forbidden foods, the hunger foods. You can't really talk about the value of Africa if we're not talking about the value of the food in a very contemporary, dynamic way, and therefore highlighting the foods becomes critically important, the local foods. The mentioning that the West is the best than the rest of us notion has to be dispelled. And so through Little Wanda, her superpower is African foods, introducing things like Hassa hibiscus or Mamadou millet or Mama Moringa and Baba Baobao. And the moment we start creating characters around the foods, we can start changing the narrative and the power that these foods can be used to heal, and why the women who are being displaced to this very day because of food safety reasons in the markets or by the grocery stores that are coming because of the new malls or the hottest cool thing happening, that what at the end of the day does that cause of displacing economic dollars that will now create poverty, that will give you the even more of a reason why the tax revenue base has to be increased to create welfare programs, because these women have now been displaced. So part of our role through the creation of not only the book projects, the audiobooks, as well as building a network with an online platform where you can be able to find your own Wanda woman and be able to support her. And so being able to know that there is a location where we can identify them, we can support them, we can advocate for them, we can celebrate them, and we can help innovate what they're doing by creating access to market opportunities using a fun, engaging characters such as Where is Wanda? And so we highlight their stories through this pathway that is very reachable and engaging for children, but at the end of the day, it's really lighting up the little Wanda in all of us and saying that we can be everyday food heroes that we never really thought about before.
You know, Timber, this is, yeah, I think, first for all of you, for the entire panel, I couldn't help, as soon as you said the superpower was food, I couldn't help but think of Popeye. And think about, I have three daughters, and you know, Popeye eat their spinach, and all of our little African boys and girls sort of hearing about Mama Millet and the importance of eating fufu and fonio and African foods. You know, very, very powerful. And I think it goes to what Heather said in terms of diffusion of ideas and the diffusion of the ideas about African foods and the nutritional value of them, and what Pat said around sort of really creating a community and engaging the private sector in a lot of these initiatives. I want you guys to come back. We're going to come back this way, just really specifically, because one of the things we want to do is to have some recommendations and some real points of connection, some points of contribution that the diaspora can make, and also just ways that they can really collaborate. So even some bullet points on how the African diaspora policy recommendations, Tamara, Heather, and Pat, on how the African diaspora can be a part of the transformation that's occurring in African agriculture. What can we do, or what do you want in terms of policy recommendations? What do you want to have happen to engage the diaspora more in this endeavor? Tamara, only you lead us off.
Sure. I mean, some of the items I had just highlighted in my notes, but I definitely do recognize that USAID has a gender empowerment index that is identifying markers around value of voices of women and economic, support that they're receiving by generating income. Yet again, the role that it's hard for me to separate government, having lived in that world, but they do play a very chief role. And so for those diasporans who are currently working in federal agencies, I beg upon you to be in a position to advocate and speak up. And I know some people don't want to be called the token, but you have given a power of position, and it has to be leveraged to where you're speaking up for those who are voiceless. And that is what I mean about finding what we need already within, and that is our voice.
And I can't help but think about your comment around data equals dollars, and the African diaspora here in the U.S. and in various communities know a lot about the issues and the challenges, but the opportunities that are on the ground, and being able to coalesce that information and really turn that data into data for decision making can equal dollars. So I just wanted to add that point, something I took from your notes. Really, really profound. Heather, the diaspora wants to connect, they want to contribute, collaborate. What can we do with the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to go off on one thing though. When you talked about the thing that struck a chord for me is we do a lot of appropriate technology introduction, and what we find is that the women farmers take up that technology at such a greater rate than their male counterparts. It's always fascinating to me, and we just find that if you really want to introduce new technology in farming, you actually have to start with the women, which is kind of something different than most people think. But I wanted to bring that up because I thought that, to me, that's been one of my learnings as I travel around and talk to a lot of the farmers. In terms of the diaspora, first of all of this work is actually being done on the ground with our implementing partner, an organization called PIND, which is all Nigerian development professionals, some of whom were diaspora, who chose to come back to Nigeria to be part of this initiative. So I think, I'm not saying that that's the role for everybody, but I think to me that's always been, I think, a very moving part of some of the people's stories that I meet. They gave up an awful lot, jobs that paid better, cushy lifestyles to come back and work with farmers in the Niger Delta. And to me, that's, an enormously powerful testament of what the power of the diaspora can be on a daily basis. But we talked about, CD mentioned scale, and that's something that we talk about a lot. And one of the biggest things holding back agribusiness in Nigeria is financing. Hands down. We spend a lot of time working with banks, and our partners work with banks. And the reality is, it is very, very hard to get banks to lend money to any kind of agriculture. They just don't understand it. I mean, it's really interesting to me. What we find, it's more ignorance than anything else, but they just don't understand the business part of agribusiness. I think so many bankers that we run into really still look at it as a subsistence, one farmer in the back of his house with the hoe and, getting a couple of some corn at the end of the season to feed his family. There just hasn't been this, throughout the continent, really the understanding of the agribusiness opportunities there. But it's not just debt financing, right? And I think this is one of the things that we've been talking a lot to USAID as they try to reach out to the diaspora to kind of promote some of the development projects throughout the continent. It's also equity financing, right? So if I could wave a wand, I would say that that's one of the things that would be the biggest contribution that the diaspora could have, is looking at ways to really become investors in agriculture in Africa. There are enormous opportunities, and guess what? You would make money. So it would be both a good thing and a profitable thing. And so to me, what we're looking at, and like I said, our partners USAID is how can we leverage some of these amazing diaspora networks that are existent particularly in America right now is where we're starting. Many of whom give money back. How can you do that in a more productive way, in a way that would really try to take some of these projects up to scale? And I think that is the big challenge, right? Is how do you link the diaspora money with the projects and with the investment opportunities, and where are those platforms to do that? So I think that's, and I'm really heartened that USAID is starting to think about this, because there are a lot of people who will come up to me and say, I'm Nigerian, I'd love to invest in Nigeria. I don't know where to go to find out what to invest in. So it's creating those platforms and figuring out ways to connect the diaspora to the needs in a more effective way. And so I'm hopeful that we're starting that, and this type of a conversation, I think I'd love to hear some ideas more about how to do that.
Heather, I think you set up, I don't think I've ever seen such a perfect segue to Pat Shake, where she can, the ball is in the square center of the strike zone, and she just has to swing, because Corporate Council on Africa and engaging private sector investors, I think, is key. So Pat, why don't you take it away?
Okay, so I do agree with what Heather said. I mean, a business entity is going to be looking at scalability and economies of scale. They do not, they're in it for business, and only the business sector can create jobs, and only the agribusiness sector in Africa can deliver the kind of results in terms of contribution to the GDP rate, because 60% of the people are involved in agriculture, but they're involved in primarily subsistence farming. So if you want to scale this up, you're going to have to move toward a business model that creates economies of scale, that creates job opportunities for everyone across that value chain, from production to processing to marketing and distribution. And I think a lot of young people are turned off because there isn't a business model being articulated where they can be involved in these value chains at different levels depending on their expertise. We need people who are not only want to get involved in production because they have that capability, but processing. Much of what's being lost is being lost through the transport of these commodities to markets. You need people who have some experience in cold chain, and it doesn't have to be a conventional cold chain that we know about in the West, but a cold chain that would be supportive of moving those very perishable crops from the farm to the processing center. We need young people that are involved with technology. They know this technology. They could help farmers in terms of calling up commodities, using the cell phone. Some countries already use it. And let's not forget the African Union, where you have countries, every African country agreed to CAADP proposals on agriculture. Some countries have done their part, and those that are investing in their agricultural sector, like Ethiopia, like Cote d'Ivoire, like Ghana, they're having real results. You've got to have government policies and regulations that support agriculture. You do need financing, and there are creative ways, as you said, of getting financing, but the country also needs to put its money where its mouth is. And many of these countries have not. They've talked a lot about agriculture, but they haven't done it. So I think if you look at those countries that have committed to their CAADP processes, then you will find that they've done quite well. You also need to look at the scientific community. There is a body of knowledge, and USDA has a lot of this through, and the Asian Vegetable Research Development Center, that has a regional office in Arusha, Tanzania. Many of these native crops have already been cataloged, but the information is sitting on the shelf. So they know what native indigenous crops can be helpful, but nobody has bothered to pull that information off. We don't need more research. We need to use what we have. And it's sitting up there because I've been there and I've seen it. And I said, what are you doing with this research? Why aren't you applying it? Why aren't you telling farmers that these native crops are good? But no one has gone back. So I think that, sometimes there's too much information out there and people don't know where to go. Some of this is out there. I do think that the U.S. business community does want to get involved, but there has to be certain conditions for them to go in. And they have gone into certain countries. And I will say this too, and you may be against marketing boards or whatever. I don't think we always should look at the Western model, but when you look at certain crops in Africa where the sector has done quite well, like cocoa, like coffee, like tea, you'll find that the government policies and regulations support those industries. You've got to have the government involved in this, and it starts with the government. And if the government isn't involved, the business people will not go in. It's as simple as that. They will not, if there are government policies and regulations that will not support an agribusiness sector, then there's no reason for them to go in. So we've got to get these policies and procedures straightened out. We've got to get different forms of financing. You look at what the U.S. government is offering through MCC. That is the government entity that can make a difference. The kind of leverage that the MCC funds can give an African country will help them to jumpstart the economy. And I'll leave you with this last saying. I remember when former President Kufuor of Ghana was in power, he said, and it's not a direct quote, but it's paraphrasing what he said. He said without those MCC funds, Ghana would have never had that jump start to their economy that they needed. So that funding helped Ghana to get their economy going. Yes, you can have small projects from USAID and others, but you really do need a larger financing to jumpstart their economies. And I think MCC, they're not in every country, but MCC is one entity that can do it if you're looking at the government approach to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. That was excellent, and I think all three panelists. I think if I had to somewhat summarize some of what we've heard, the diaspora plays a critical role in the food and nutritional security for transforming African agriculture. There's ways to engage as it relates to, let's just start down the line, in terms of market demand. A lot of the African diaspora here know the traditional food crops that powered your youth before you may have come to the country, or powered the youth of your family members. And that market pull of the U.S. market for African foods creates the market demand that creates local jobs and local livelihoods. And so that market pull and that market force is really something that I think the African diaspora can utilize and leverage, not only to help their communities here, but also to transform lives in Africa. So the market aspects to African agriculture and how the diaspora can play a significant role is really critical. smallholder farming training and aggregation. Pat said it. You know, farming is a business. When you think about small scale farmers, when we talk about them as small scale farmers, it means the activity that they do. They're farming on a small scale. But when you call them small scale producers, then you're talking about the output from their activity. And so that production, are they producing something? And where does some of that expertise and some of that technology really lie? A lot of it is here in the U.S. with African diaspora, such as in this room, who have been there and done that, whether you grew up in Oklahoma and in a livestock belt of the country, or whether you actually have a farm here in the U.S. But how do we look at the technical assistance and the capacity building that can come from African diaspora to play a critical role, whether they're here and, as Heather said, going back and leading projects in the Niger Delta, or offering some type of technical assistance and capacity building to really look at farmer training and aggregation to turn small-scale farmers into small-scale producers that are really meeting the market demand. I think that's a critical role that the diaspora can play. Technology. We all know the power of our mobile phones. That's a phone, that's a computer, that's a camera, that's anything that we can think of. It happens in the palm of our hand. But there's other technology that's coming that's stimulating not only productivity here in the U.S. but around the world. And how are we, as the African diaspora, those in the diaspora, helping that technology reach lives and livelihoods in creating enterprises in the African continent? That technology transfer is critical to transforming African agriculture, and it's something that we have in the power of our hands, or at least in the research that we've done. And how do we take that research from here to action on the ground in Africa? And then finally, I would say, and this came through almost in every panelist, whether it's data for dollars or whether it's investing in the African enterprise that are on the ground. This is financing, whether it's debt, equity, grants, what have you, but really putting our money where our passion is and really helping power African agriculture through some types of leverage investment. And there are organizations such as the Corporate Council on Africa that can help facilitate some of these relationships, that those of you who want to invest in African agriculture in Africa, now we're creating investable deals where there really is an opportunity to make a difference and to make money. So those are some areas around the market, around the finance, around technology, and then really in terms of empowering Africans and smallholders to be small-scale producers that I've heard from real practical ways to engage. We were supposed to have an intervention right now, not an intervention, a break. Sorry, a break from 3:15 to I think 3:30. I talked to some of the organizers, and I think that would be somewhat disruptive to the momentum that we have going on. And so what I'd like to do is let me do two things just from a protocol standpoint. If Her Excellency wants to give some concluding remarks before we go to Q&A, or our esteemed host with the most, Mel Foote, just some concluding remarks before we go to open Q&A, and then I'll give you the audience 30 minutes for interaction with the panelists. But I want to respect the fact that there was a break on the panel.
Well, I thank you so much. I think interesting discussions from our panelists. Appreciate all you're doing. My sister Patricia, we appreciate all your work you're doing on behalf of the Corporate Council of Africa, and Miss Heather, we appreciate you in the Delta region. I can honestly tell you that next to peace and security, agriculture is the next item on the agenda for the African Union, because we realize that it is only through agriculture that we can begin to also turn the corner when it comes to health, disease, and suffering in Africa. There is no two ways about it. By simply improving the nutritional status of a population, one could comfortably cut the healthcare budget in half. It is that simple. So yes, agriculture is at the forefront when it comes to issues that are leading the agenda for the African Union. I would like to bring to your attention an organization that was created by the State Department. It's called U.S. State Department. It's called African Women Entrepreneurs Program, AWEP. These women are very well established now in most African countries, and they are doing incredible work. As my sister Heather said, it starts with women. In my opinion, it stays with women, and it ends with women. These women are involved in all kinds of businesses, including agribusiness. What they are doing now is forming cooperatives. You find that the small-scale farmer cannot produce enough produce to supply a chain department store. However, when they come together, they're able to do so. The African Union, the various governments as well, starting from the African Union, they also realize that there needs to be some harmonization of cross-border processes from one country to the other. I know West Africa through ECOSOC is really working very hard. Countries like Ghana, your produce, I think cross-border, they say no more than 3 days because they realize that these are perishable goods that must go from the field to the end point as quickly as possible. A lot of farmers are losing a lot of produce because of that. Refrigeration is another issue. So there are problems, but the good thing is we are aware of the problems and the solutions are being sought. We have some successes, but AWAP is a young entity that a lot of people are not aware of. What we're trying to do on our end is now establish an AWAP chapter in the United States, which is made up of diaspora women. So now diaspora women and men who wish to invest can now network with AWAP organizations on the continent to try and facilitate participation by the diaspora in agribusiness. I have to say, slowly but sure, I personally know many diaspora now who went back home and are involved in the agribusiness. It's just not something that we used to hear, but it's happening now, and it's a reality, and it's actually a good business to get involved in. So through this mission, we are doing our part to try and, again, organize the diaspora so we can open up these opportunities for the diaspora to invest and, in the end, participate in the building of Africa and clearly also join hands with our brothers and sisters on the continent to build the Africa that we want. Funding, of course, is an issue. And that's when I go back again to the diaspora. We are going to be launching our $100 million campaign because we, the diaspora, who put $65 billion into Africa every year, we average maybe 40 billion year in, year out, past 10 years. Surely we can raise enough funds to begin to address and fund ourselves when it comes to some of these projects. So we have a responsibility as the African Union to pave the way for the diaspora to walk the walk. I do know for a fact that the diaspora are ready, willing, and able to do what it takes to move the African agenda forward. And I can tell you, out of this office, we're definitely going to do our part to see to it that whatever path needs to be paved for the diaspora to walk the walk, we'll do our best to do so.
This is the home now for the Ron Brown series. So we have, since she's been here since January, I can just say that I feel like she's my boss. And every time she calls, she says, jump, I say, how high? But I'm happy about that, you know. I finally got some leadership around here. Yeah. I spent many years in Africa. A lot of people don't know that. They've always known me to be here in Washington. And I've been here a long time. and I'm trying to figure out how to get out of here. But I've also spent many years in Africa. I spent years in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, a lot of East Africa stuff, but like 7 years. The most successful project I did in Somalia under AfriCare, I called it a tool and seed chest. I was working with refugee populations, and I got a grant for $15,000 from the Canadian government. So I just bought local hand tools. I brought hoes and axes, and I bought a bunch of seeds, and basically just made them available to anybody who wanted them. And I can guarantee you that those tools didn't get stolen. They were used to plant food, and I'm sure people are eating today because of that project. I read an article over the weekend about how corporations are now exploiting the third world in Brazil and Africa. They talk about Nestle and how now you got obesity where you never had obesity before. And you go to South Africa and they celebrating Popeye's chicken, your place, CD. They're celebrating Popeye's chicken and pizza. And I'm saying, okay, here we come. Diabetes, hypertension. We'll talk about that tomorrow in the health roundtable. But, you know, I'm all for investing in Africa, but I'm not for killing Africans in the process. So how do we make sure that American corporations that are going to Africa, happy about it, but also they're doing well, but we want them also to do good, you know? We want people to live healthy and productive lives. And I think we in the diaspora have to be the vanguard, making a lot of hay on that. There's also this trend of urban migration in Africa. You know, the rural young are moving to Accra, they're moving to Addis, they're moving to Nairobi, they're going to Joburg. And I asked myself, all the projections are that the population in Africa is going to explode. And already we're talking about 40-50% of the population under 30 years old, maybe younger than that. So we're talking about doubling the population. And I'm asking myself, how are people going to eat? You know, what is the projection going forward? And I'm not sure that we're there now. You know, also Africa is being contracted to Middle Eastern countries and others to grow food. They're growing vegetables from Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia in Africa, and Africans don't have access to that food. You know, they got big fences there, and you see them cabbages and you see that corn, you can't touch it. They'll shoot you over that corn because of it being, you know, it's protected, it's private, if you will. And I'm glad we got Pat Sheck here. Pat Sheck is really, I think, the most informed person on Africa agriculture in the country, you know. Really, the woman is brilliant. Her background is just there. She's been in places that none of us have been there. But she's also working for Corporate Council in Africa, which is the largest, most powerful network of American corporations that are working in Africa today, you know. And they do a lot of good work. They do a lot of powerful work. She got a tremendous network of companies who are part of Corporate Council in Africa. But how do you keep them in line? Not so much keep them in line, but how do you encourage investment to look at Africa at the same time to do well? It's not an easy task, you know, and I know that. I also asked myself about the African Development Bank, and Adesina, the new president, is a farmer. You know, he was the Minister of Agriculture for Nigeria prior to assuming the role of the head of the African Development Bank. I've had several conversations with him. I like the guy myself. I think he's brilliant. I think he knows a lot of stuff. But I'm asking myself, is ADB transforming Africa in the way of agriculture? You know, I know there's been, I heard $200 million, maybe more than that has gone into, from the ADB in terms of Africa. Now, the diaspora plays a unique role. You know, right now is an interesting time. You know, 1 year ago, we were celebrating Barack Obama, and all of us were giddy, you know. 1 year later, look what we got, you know. And, you know, everywhere I go, it's just moaning and groaning, you know, agonizing and all that. I'll tell you, don't agonize, organize, you know. All this agony all over the place. But I think it's a time that we look at ourselves, you know. This is the time that we need to get organized. If ever there was a time that the diaspora need to get organized, that time is now, you know. And I've been having heart-to-heart discussions with Ambassador Chiambori around that, and we're planning a number. We have in this room, we're going to have a diaspora brain trust on Thursday evening. And I got Jesse Jackson coming. I got Leonard Jeffries. I got Malefi Asante. I got Julius Garvey, Marcus Garvey's son. All of these people are coming to talk about how do we work together. Now, we're going to work together, but we got to work together on a range of issues, not only in terms of agriculture, but on trade, on conflict resolution, on all of the issues concerning Africa. How are we going to pressure the United States government to do something if we're busy fighting each other, busy undermining the work that we do, zero-sum game, I think that's the way they put it. But I want to thank you, CD. I started working with CD. He was a little boy. He was playing with his trucks and, he first came around, he wanted to be involved in CFA, so we got him involved in but we go back to the Peace Corps. I'm a Peace Corps volunteer, and I met CD. CD was with the Peace Corps at the time. And so we have that link. And I've always thought that he's one of the, clearly a hard-driving, focused individual. And so I'm really happy to see what you've done. You went through with the Obama administration, and now you landed with the African Development Foundation. So I'm glad to see you in this role. And Wanda, she is a powerhouse. What I say about her, she had energy galore. I don't know. I think it's the stuff she's drinking. But she has tremendous energy, tremendous talent, and she's committed to this work. Committed. You can't stop her, and nothing stops her. So it's great to have her here and great to be, because she is the next generation when you think about it. Their approach is one of people to people. They touch everybody. But I like to see her work, and I follow her on Facebook and LinkedIn and all that stuff. And she is absolutely committed to improving the quality of life for African people. So I want to thank. So that's what I want to say, CD. But it's great to be here. I enjoyed the conversation. But I got a lot of questions here, and I'll hold some of those to the Q&A portion. But I just wonder, when we talk about transforming Africa agriculture, I see something big that needs to happen. And I see something that's because African people climate change is devastating Africa. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the flooding in Miami and Houston, but come on, I'm looking at Sierra Leone, I'm looking at Nigeria, mm-hmm. looking at Uganda, mm-hmm. I'm looking at climate change, and nobody, not even a peep. Mm-hmm. New York Times ain't covering that, like Black lives don't matter anymore, and so I'm asking myself, all the pollution and everything is coming from the West. We're eroding the environment left and right, and who's paying the price? The most vulnerable, And we are not having anything to say about it, and I think the diaspora has got to be at the forefront in holding up that flag also. So having said those few things, thank you very much. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
All right. Thank you, Mel. And honestly, these applause are to thank you for your leadership of CFA, but also the wisdom that led you to create the Ron Brown African Affairs series. It is sort of must-see TV, must-attend event in September. It's on everybody's calendar, everybody's agenda, and I'm glad you have a new home here at the Africa House. Mel, it goes back almost 20 years, mid-90s with Peace Corps South Africa 1. So to see you still bringing the crowd and really championing the efforts and asking the tough questions, I think it's really important, and we need you. So thanks for all that you do, definitely. I think Mel opened it up with the first question. I want to take rounds of 3 for our panels. So the first one I think is around climate change. So panelists, just think about your thoughts on that. The young lady here with the head.
Yes, my name is Luana Kendall with CFA African, Health Infrastructure Committee. I lost my train of thought. I was wondering if we could have a parallel scenario where you have the small farmers do microfinancing and get the education for doing investments, learning how to grow crops and nutrition as one portion, and the second portion, the corporate entity doing large production and agricultural infrastructure.
That's great. Thank you. Another gentleman here in the front.
Hello, I'm Lawrence Freeman. I've been working on economic development, research, consulting in Africa for about over 25 years. I wanted to say, Madam Ambassador, I agree with 2 of your main points. One is that Africa can become self-sufficient in food and become a net food exporter. There's no doubt in my mind that can happen. And two is I agree with you about former President Mbeki. I think he got a very bad deal. He was correct in saying that poverty is a cofactor of AIDS, not just nutrition, healthcare, living conditions, sanitation, living in ghettos. So those 2 points you're correct on. The larger question is how do we transform? It's obvious that Africa can produce enormous amount of food and export it. How do we do that? And many of the panelists discussed various ways. From my standpoint, what is absolutely needed is infrastructure. We need rail development crisscrossing the continent. We need to minimally, my calculations are we need 1,000 gigawatts of electricity. Not megawatts, but gigawatts if we want to have a decent standard of living. We need to have water development policies. By the way, I'm the vice chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee to the Lake Chad Basin Commission because I have a plan called TransAqua to bring water from the Congo River Basin to Lake Chad. So I wanted you to talk about that maybe, Ms. Ambassador. I know that if you look at the recent years, it's all been China. United States has a few projects, MCC, they're tiny. China just finished the Ethiopian-Djibouti Railway, which I was fortunate to be there at the celebration in Addis, the standard gauge. There's an MOU being discussed for $41 billion for Nigerian railways. Now, those of us who have been to Nigeria, they desperately need railroads, along with many other things. And these would be training Africans. 30,000 Africans were employed in the standard gauge. They're talking about over 100,000 Nigerians. And that's a big issue because there's a massive amount of unemployment among young people in Nigeria, which is an Achilles heel. China is demonized by people. I don't respect that at all. I think they're not colonizing. They're doing things that is essential. But it requires public government involvement. These sectors cannot be done by the private sector. I discussed this with Steve Hayes many times. They can participate. Can we get the African Union has a plan for 20,063 for big infrastructure development. We have to have public sector involvement. The China Exim Bank is long-term low interest rate. That's correct. How do we move that forward from the African Union perspective? To me, this is a central question for development of agriculture.
Thanks. One more gentleman in the front, the blue jacket.
My name is Alan Herman. I'm the founding dean. I was the founding dean of South Africa's National School of Public Health. I'm now the chief medical officer of Cannabis Science, one of the sponsors. What's fascinating to me is that indigenous knowledge systems are never spoken about. It's as if Africans have no knowledge to pass on. And in every sub-Saharan African country that I know of, they have a strong agricultural indigenous knowledge system. One of the best examples is in South Africa, in a Durban company that was founded in the 60s called ProNutro, that was built around how to feed children that were malnourished. My earliest job was I was a physician responsible for about 500,000 people where the infant mortality rate was 15%. 150 per 1,000 kids died in the first year of life. And the malnutrition rates were upwards of 70. And I started prescribing food, especially ProNutro, because it didn't make sense to wait until they were dying and then prescribe something to help them to save their lives because they were still malnourished. But it came from a personal experience as a child growing up in South Africa that had grandparents and parents who knew how to use the indigenous systems of food and nutrition. And great presentations by all of you, but I not once heard about Africans being at the center of this intellectual issue. In 1885, as the ambassador said, there was a balkanization of Africa into different countries by the Europeans. But before 1885, from 1400 to 1885, there was a balkanization of the minds of Africans. It actually still occurs right now. And today I heard many people speak about Africans as if they are them, not us. Africans are us, not them. And I'm sort of want somebody to explain to me, as if I'm 5 years old, why we don't think Africans have anything to give. In fact, they are the people who can give most, and you ought to follow them. And I mean, I'm a bit passionate about this. I get annoyed. Because when I first came to this country, I was told about how Africans needed this and that. I have 2 doctors from African universities. I worked at the NIH. I taught at all the fancy universities in this country, and I'm still considered to be less qualified than some kid who just got his master's degree from some American institution that's actually not that very good.
Thank you, Doctor. So four questions on the table. One, the role of climate change and the impact of climate change on transforming African agriculture, the integration of micro and large farming systems, farming practices and activities. Can we look at some level of integration on both sides? Infrastructure, power, water, and indigenous knowledge systems. So let me turn first to Madam Ambassador to address the questions that, infrastructure and maybe indigenous knowledge systems as well. But the floor is yours.
Okay. Why China? That's a $1 million question. The reality is, when I'm hungry today and I need food now, I'm going to go with whoever gives me the food today, without conditions, without restrictions. If the truth be told, when African leaders, countries have needed funding, the Western world, you gotta answer this, you gotta meet this, there are all these conditions. China, they'll say how much, and you get the money. African countries are dealing with day-to-day issues, people who are alive now, who are hungry now, who need situations taken care of now. Unfortunately, we're still in the now phase. We don't have time to waste. We can't afford to wait for some considerations, and also going to areas like the World Bank and IMF and all the loans that our countries have. A lot of them may go back to our colonial masters. We're still paying interest on those loans, and so sometimes it makes it difficult to access some of the funding that we otherwise could. Sadly, China is happy to jump in and give money to Africa. Our own offices in Addis, beautiful offices, fully funded by the Chinese. So it's a bit disturbing sometimes when you hear the Western world complain about China going into Africa, but when the Africans want to engage the Western world, there are roadblocks and mountains to climb, when China can just come in and take care of it. I'm not saying it's right. We're actually going through a second wave of, you could say, in some cases, you look at it as we are being colonized by China, so to speak, and pretty soon China would be owning a good chunk of Africa. We are aware of that, and we're doing everything possible from the AU to keep that from continuing. However, the reality is, it is what it is, and we are where we are. We need the funding, and we need it now. We are not blind to what could possibly happen with the increased participation from the Chinese. You fly into any airline intra-Africa, most of the time, half the passengers are Chinese. So they're moving in fast and furious. I think it's estimated by 2030, maybe 2050, we should have about 300 million Chinese in Africa. Even the Chinese governments themselves are giving loans to their people to go to Africa, and start businesses. From a social point of view, some of you can Google it, but even Chinamen now are going into Africa to marry. They have a website where Chinamen are advertising for wives in Africa. They're playing all kinds of games that we're now aware of. You know, we have this program of AGOA. They're marrying Africans, going to Africa, becoming Africans, starting companies, and now they are legitimate Africans, and now they do the same thing they were doing in China, except they're coming into the United States, benefiting from AGOA as Africans, but not as Chinese. So, yes, and they're also building the infrastructure in Africa. There's a railway that's being built from Cape to Cairo and another one from east to west. We need development, but we can't afford the restrictions and limitations that are being offered to, as much as we would rather deal with the West, particularly the United States. U.S. has been a good partner, a friend. U.S. never colonized us, so we don't have those issues with the U.S. that we do with our colonial masters. But nonetheless, we are aware of China, and we do have our antennas up, but sadly we are in a survival mode. And we're doing what we need to do, but we are aware of the dangers of some of the dealings we are having with China. And I'm hoping that with time, the products out of China, let's face it, even the African Union building itself, I was sitting in the lobby and you could see, oh, come on now, why is that, you know? The workmanship is never the best. There's no comparison between workmanship from the West versus from our friends from the East. But be it as it may, just like we are going to India for healthcare, that's not really what we want to do. But this is where we are. The bottom line is we need to develop our own systems. And it goes back again to the diaspora, that the diaspora have got to organize, and the diaspora have got to take their rightful place in Africa. And let me reiterate that the diaspora are all people of African descent, because I kind of get this feeling that sometimes when we start talking diaspora, people think continental Africans. Now, the African Union is looking to all people of African descent to join hands and participate in the development of Africa. Otherwise, we can sit back and just complain, but unless we're willing to do what it takes so we can effectively play our part, the Chinese will continue to recolonize us, so to speak. So it is a problem, but we're aware of it.
Okay, let's turn to, thank you, Madam Ambassador. Let's turn to some of the other points that were raised around climate change, around micro and large farming entities, as well as indigenous knowledge systems. Pat?
Okay, so when I was talking about the Asian Vegetable Research Development Center, the work that's being done at those centers are being done by African researchers. So even though it's under the umbrella of the Taiwanese government, the research is indigenous. So I should have been clearer. So yes, we do recognize the contribution of indigenous people, especially when you're going into a country that you should have indigenous people, no question, at all levels in agribusiness, because they can contribute. And when I talked about young people, it was referring to indigenous people. With regard to micro versus commercial production, I don't think you need to have an either or. I think we need to be very creative. And I think that you can take smallholder farmers. It's in the aggregation of the produce that they're producing, or the livestock they're producing. That's where it kind of falls down, because you got a little farmer over here, a little farmer over here. Somebody has to bring that whole system together so you can have large commercial production and you can also have smallholder production. But we need the talent to bring all of that together in the aggregation to create economies of scale if you're going to serve both your domestic, your regional, and your international markets. Now, on climate change, this is a big issue, and it's a big issue even in the West. And, you know, there's some people who are denying it, and there's some people who are saying it's a real issue. So we try, at least, and when I advise people, I try to make sure that they are taking into account climate change. We shouldn't just be going in saying plant corn if that's not the appropriate crop. I'm just using that as an example in terms of what's happening in that country with regard to climate change. And I think you're hearing more and more scientists looking at that saying, is this the appropriate? That's where we need the science. Is this the appropriate crops or crops to be grown or livestock operations? Because then livestock too, you have waste products that are affecting the atmosphere and climate change. So all of that has to be taken into account. But the bottom line is money and how businesses think of that. And if they think of it in the terms of economic viability, then they'll do it. And I think more and more businesses are coming to the conclusion that climate change is real and that we've got to do something about it. But there's still a significant number of folks that either don't want to admit it or are looking at pure economics and nothing else. But that has got to change because everybody's vulnerable. Look what happened here. Everybody is. And a lot of people won't say it's climate change, but it is.
I just wanted to speak to that point on indigenous systems as well as the climate change issue. Having the pleasure of at least growing up in Oklahoma as it relates to climate smart agriculture, we know of Oklahoma has a lot of indigenous tribes, 500 we have in the States, and a good portion of that is in Oklahoma, which is Cherokee for Red people. And so we know of three sisters, for instance, corn, bean, squash. It has it's known as an indigenous practice that I just saw on Twitter and I retweeted that is being used to also grow in Africa in terms of indigenous agricultural practices that just makes climate smart sense. When we think about millets growing up in the Sahel, crops that I say is strong food, if you can grow and live and thrive in the Sahel, you can pretty much survive anywhere. And so the foods such as millet is an example crop of that. So when we think about agricultural policy under this current administration who denies climate change, it behooves us to be even more advantageous as an advocate to say that climate smart ag does mean indigenous crops growing in an environment that it has been accustomed to for more than a millennia, and introducing new crops that are foreign to that land poses a real problem. USDA wouldn't have its own section of foreign agriculture if it didn't understand that, and why it prohibits certain indigenous crops that are alive to come into the states compared to other parts. So that means strengthening African agricultural policy of ensuring that it puts safeguards in place of having foreign crops being introduced, displacing indigenous crops, and crops that have a strong, what we call, our bodies have a strong, our DNA has strong memory cells, and it remembers the foods that are indigenous to our bodies, and it provides a better nutritional uptake. So there's health implications, there are climate implications, there's economic implications when we go against indigenous practices and get into monocropping, get away from biodiversity crops, and getting away from foods that our ancestors have been growing. One thing that I do applaud that the ADB has done in April, it initiated a new focus around African gastronomy, and that does does create that application side to agriculture when we think about culinary programs in schools that isn't just accustomed to the hospitality industry, but needs to happen when it comes to indigenous crops as well.
I would just like to pick up on the infrastructure, because I think that that was the one piece too, with a role for the diaspora, right? I think Lagos is a fascinating case study of public-private partnerships being used on the continent to create infrastructure with a goal towards economic development. And I think it's sadly not studied enough. I even talk about this in the Niger Delta. I'm like, please just get on a plane and go to Lagos and figure out how they did really good planning of, let's connect the road to the port to the market in Kaduna. Let's figure out ways that we need infrastructure to move goods to markets in a more efficient way. And let's figure out ways that the government can partner with the private sector to create new innovative financing structures. It is the biggest, even more than financing, it is the largest constraint to unlocking the power of agriculture on the African continent. When you're looking at cassava that only has 24 hours to get to market before it starts to rot, you can't do it in the Delta, right? We get typically 30-40% crop loss just from that. Tomatoes, you're importing tomatoes at an exorbitant cost in Nigeria when you're losing 30% of the crop every year just because you can't get it to market in time. So to me, infrastructure is just an absolute key role that the diaspora could be playing, either from an investment way or from a policy standpoint.
My name is Kwame Danko. I'm the station manager, African Union Radio Station, right here in the building. So my question is, what are we doing? What sort of pragmatic measures are we putting in place to curb GMO food? Because it's affecting Africa so much. How do we stop that? Because, yes, that's my question. Maybe today, nutritionists or any of the experts who can sort of dive into this question and then help solve this problem.
My name is Bridget Beng. I'm from Cameroon. My question is, what do you do, or what do you have in place to help those who are trying to add value to what you have been doing already? Like add value to corn, cassava, soya bean. Because it is imperative that we do something that is that has a short course. Because like a cocoa farmer's daughter, when we get up in the morning to go to the farm, if we don't have something to eat, which then the whole day is not productive, because by the time you are going to the farm, what you are thinking is what you eat, which fruit is ready to pick. So by the time you go to the farm, you're only thinking of how to eat or what to eat. So your productive time is shortened. And then when you work for 2 hours, now you are thinking of what you eat when you go home. So now, going through that, I have tried to see what can bring us together to give us powers, because you do cassava, you sell it in a price that you don't like because you want to feed your family. You grow corn, you are forced to sell it in below the market price because you want to feed your family. So now I want you guys that have done so much work, so much research, to help these farmers add value to their crop. Like a corn farmer will know that they are going to grow corn and sell corn cobs. To me, for example, I'm growing mushrooms. So women can grow mushroom in small quantities, in small cooperatives. So you are adding value to corn. So now they have the power not to sell corn. Or what can you do to help me that wants to use your waste?
Yes. My name's Brad Brown. I'm a marine fishery scientist by profession. And I wonder why, in the broad scope of agriculture and food and nutrition, that the contribution and the value of ocean fisheries or capture fisheries were not mentioned, since Africa at present probably loses more there than could ever be made up by agriculture. And also with specific relativity to the Niger Delta region, you mentioned a lot of partnerships, but I didn't hear the linking together of the government institutions like the Nigerian Institute of Marine and Oceanographic Research and the universities like University of Port Harcourt's Sustainable Development Body Group, which I've had the opportunity to do some work with, because I think there's a tremendous amount of expertise right there in the region, but it often isn't all that well linked to each other.
So the catchword that a lot of people throwing around is sustainable agriculture, and there's no definition for sustainable agriculture. It's all over the place. If we could come up with a method of defining best practices or business practices to give us some constraints or some definition of sustainable agriculture. 3 on the top of my list is no fossil fuel usage in the production or the transportation. No chemical usage in the production of it, and also good water conservation practices in the production of agriculture. The other aspect of agriculture as it relates to Africa is what Tambra was talking about for nutrition is, are we talking about pre-colonization standards of nutrition, of educating people of what the African diet was before colonization, which doesn't include cassava? So can we address that issue? Thank you.
Gentlemen, yes.
Hi, yes. My name is Ewell Anderson. I'm with the African American Future Society. I do a lot of analysis work on these types of projections. One of the thoughts that I have, Madam Ambassador spoke about 300 million Chinese ending up in Africa, I think, in the next 10, 15 years. The question that I have is, or comment, there's approximately about 30 million more Chinese men than there are women to marry as a byproduct of the one-child Chinese policy. The amazing part is no one thought of forecasting the potential impact of that. And of course, those Chinese men will go to the path of least resistance and go to a country like Africa and, marry the women. The question, however, again, you have 30 million men that could potentially marry one African woman with each fertility rate, let's say an average of just 3 children. You have a potentially 160 million Africans being lifted out of poverty. I don't think there's any USAID program that will impact 160 million people. So at the end of the day, what does Africa look like with 160 million people being lifted out of poverty within the next 10 years? 30 million men, 1 woman married, 3 children per family. So that's 30 times, or 120 million, whatever the number is. It's a lot of hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty.
The gentleman here.
My name is Fred Kalema Musoke. I hail from Uganda. I've lived here for 40 years. I worked in the World Bank for 20 years. I'm now retired and work as an independent consultant. It's too bad the ambassador has left, maybe because of my background working for the World Bank. By the way, in the World Bank, I worked for the private sector in IFC. So this issue of conditionality, we need to ask ourselves, where did it come from? What we are looking at the Chinese as like easy money and all that, I don't want to vilify the West for asking for conditionalities. There is a reason why they started asking for conditionalities. I think it has to do with either transparency or accountability. And I would want to ask the ambassador, if I came to her to borrow money, would she, and she doesn't know me, would she ask me for any conditionalities? If we look at it that way, maybe we can actually deal with the West for long-term sustainability, but it came from somewhere. We Africans asked for structural adjustment loans because they were easy they were easy to kind of like not account for it. The projects that the World Bank funded earlier, targeting education, health, and infrastructure, they were not easy for us to, they were not susceptible to much corruption. That's the beginning of the conditionalities, as far as I'm concerned. And it's not for sabotaging Africa, it's to make us responsive and accountable for what we borrow. We have a lot on the books, but it's because we are trying to, I missed the session this morning about governance, and maybe it was covered, but I think that's the reason. If we look at it that way, maybe we can still engage the West for long-term investments. The other one somebody mentioned on cooperatives. Africa, post-independence, there were a lot of cooperatives linked to marketing boards, and they were working very well until the politicians came in and realized, I don't know for why. Now they're thinking back, oh yeah, we need the cooperatives. But the cooperative, today, if they were working, there would be a very good link between microfinance and the big, commercial farmers. The last one was the infrastructure. I think the railways, and I mentioned this, the railways, the infrastructure would work very well, but I think Africa needs cold storage in addition to the infrastructure.
Okay. Just because we had a lot of men, and there was a young lady who wanted to say one final comment there. Yes, you.
Thank you. Hi to my fellow Ugandan. I was born and raised in Uganda too. I would like to highlight some of the ways that NGOs do us a disservice. All of your NGOs and the international development community as a whole. Somebody mentioned seeds. Yes, sorry. My grandmother is a farmer. She has been a farmer for the last 60 years. 40 years ago, she was a smallholder farmer who was doing very well. And then we got seeds from Monsanto, and now every year she has to buy seeds. But before, she used to save her seeds and plant. She raised 6 children doing exactly that. And at that time, she lived on $1 a day. But now, on that $1 a day, she has to take out the extra money every year to buy her new agricultural input. And these are seeds that are distributed by your organizations, by the international development, by many organizations, by the international development community as a whole, because they come from our government grant programs from the US, the UK, and even though it looks on paper that like these are high yield programs, it's actually causing economic slavery. And in the future, people are going to get poorer and poorer. So I would like to know what you think about that. And then my other point is to Miss Tambra. Have you ever wondered why it is that corn is the food that is pushed onto Africa in our refugee camps? Is it the most high nutritive grain in the world? Ethiopia has teff. It's a complete food. It has protein. It has the macro and micronutrients. Why are we forced to grow, buy, receive aid of corn when you in the nutritional world know that there are other high value crops? Is it because that's the crop that American farmers grow? Or are you actually trying to help Africans who everybody has agreed we have a malnutrition issue? So Ms. Tambra, I would really like to know what your opinion is on that subject.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're going to have to do this rapid fire because I know someone has a hard stop at 10 minutes. So I want to combine this so I can summarize. So there was the GMO foods, which I think we can link to sort of somewhat of the sort of seed distribution systems question around importation of seeds, of GMO foods to Africa. There was a question that was great from my sister from Cameroon around basically value addition or sort of waste byproducts from African agriculture, value addition, processing, your world, Pat. Ocean fisheries, a great point around aquaculture. I think, Heather, you have some knowledge of just because of the Niger Delta. The question around sustainable agriculture and whether or not a definition around no fossil fuels, no chemicals, and more efficient water use would be acceptable to some extent. And my brother had a question around the future of Africa, and if we lifted 100 million plus people out of poverty, what does that really mean with the advent of China? And China also came up on the point around conditionality. I mean, we are, what did she say? We are where we are, and it is what it is in terms of China and Africa. But is there an alternative, or could we look at ways in the conditionality around China's interest in Africa, and then having Africans be more responsible for the borrowing? So when we do give your responses to any of those questions, also use it as your closing commentary as well, because I want to make sure that I respect the time of everyone here. And also, we were supposed to end at 4:30, so we have about 7 minutes. If we divide that up into 2 minutes per response, we can get it done. All right, Heather.
So I'm going to go back to that earlier comment about local knowledge. So sadly, I'm the person you get because I'm the one in DC, where all this work is being done in Nigeria by Nigerians. What is linking with local knowledge is the platforms, right, and the diffusion of ideas, so that good ideas can be spread. And that's what we're doing, right? We're not importing American farmers over to Nigeria to give them the best practices. We're really looking at and partnering with NIFOR and government entities, local institutions in Nigeria to figure out what's already worked and has been proven to work, increased yields, and then helping create the platforms where farmers can actually get that information, right? So I absolutely agree that, to me, that's sustainable agriculture. When I talk about it, sustainable agriculture, which is how do you create better yields, better incomes for farmers by harnessing the knowledge that you've got, by creating farmer cooperatives and associations, many of whom already exist. How do you strengthen their ability to serve their farmers better? How do you strengthen their ability to be able to go to the bank and make a loan application that will benefit 200 farmers, right? How do you link farmers together so that they've got better purchasing power for seeds, new seedlings, cassava seedlings from an institution like NIFOR? So to me, that is what we mean when we talk about sustainable agriculture, which is how do you create a platform where ideas that have been proven to work in a place as difficult as the Niger Delta diffuse those ideas out from there. And with regards to the fisheries, we have looked very closely at the fisheries sector and really see aquaculture now, farmed aquaculture, because of a lot of the degradation of the quality of the fisheries in the Niger Delta. I can't speak about the rest of the places. It's just there's more economic potential, frankly, in farmed fish right now. And that's why we're working there. That isn't to say that isn't an economic sector that deserves some attention. That isn't the sector that, for us, works the best.
Thanks, Heather. Tamara, do you want to talk about some things that were addressed directly, or whatever's on your mind?
Yeah. I think there are about 3 points. Let's hit the high point. Pre-colonial African foodways is definitely one that I focus on, explore. However, there is a multi-mix when we just think about the availability of food and where we are today. It is what it is, as the ambassador had said. So any opportunity to promote and encourage local indigenous crops is going to be the most appropriate bang for the buck in terms of a healthy Africa, wealthy Africa notion. In terms of anti-GMO and which has a strong linkage to the corn piece. There was a film that the National Academies of Science helped to support. I went to the screening a few weeks back called Food Evolution, which you probably would have wanted to be there because the way in which it was positioned was definitely trying to create a balanced conversation around genetically engineered crops, as well as the organic debate showing the sales on par organic to Whole Foods to Monsanto, 5 billion sales, 15 billion, I mean, and looking at how this particular form of GE is important to Africa to help uplift women like your mother. So you give a counter narrative, which is one that was not highlighted, and it represents an issue of even if we want to say, let's look at the facts as of what the position was, the facts still lay that we have a CSR issue, and that is diversity inclusion. That is the same issue of being able to go in and not create balanced competition, and changing laws on the continent in the name of humanitarian support that has really profiteering benefits that does not fully mean a triple bottom line for the people in the community. And so therefore we must have a holistic perspective, and we must have a platform, as we've created with Wanda, the importance of women being able to be in media, be spokespersons around what is impacting their communities and having their voices uplifted to balance this narrative that's currently being pushed. And lastly, the corn piece. Yes, when it comes to South Africa is a great example. If you wanted to say what does the Western food system look like on Africa, South Africa is a great example of giving a bird's eye view to the rest of Africa. Pap, meat, beer was pretty much a staple diet. I could pretty much lump it up in terms of I would go off to the Limpopo region, and it is complete contrast to that along the coast. And so there's the urbanization piece, the corn piece is huge, not only just in Southeast Africa, but in other parts as well. And it's one that I would say encourage what was life before corn, because it was not always there. And that's what I encourage through the platform that we have with Wanda, the books, getting that seed planted in the minds of our children, and how can we begin creating new agricultural policies that are growing from the ground up that speak to the support of local foodways as well.
Okay, I'll try to answer the question from the lady from Cameroon about marketing and value addition. It seems to me that one of the things a country should do before it decides on, first of all, what's your market? Is it a domestic market? Is it an international market? Because you have different things to consider. If it's an international market, and let's say, for example, I had a lot of countries when I was in the government saying we can export tomatoes to the United States. And Nigeria was a good example. You know, we grow a lot of tomatoes we can export to the United States. And the first question I would ask them, have you done your marketing studies? Because do you know that Mexico is right on our border? And they export a lot of tomatoes to the United States. Do you think you can compete with Mexico? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but you just need to know who are your competitors and how far away are they from the market you're trying to reach. Now, if Nigeria wanted to export to its neighbors, like they do with the wheat they import, and then turn it into flour, and they get the value addition that they now don't talk about, because now they want to cut off imports because of the oil rising, because they're not getting the revenue from oil imports, but they're getting the value addition from the wheat. Doesn't make sense economically to me. So, you know, those are the kind of questions you have to ask. I also think that countries need to consider marketing tools. For example, in Ethiopia, they created a commodity marketing board. So those farmers in certain commodities like teff, which is, someone mentioned teff, and it is a highly nutritious food. It's almost, it's on par, probably higher than quinoa, but it hasn't been marketed as such. The West doesn't know, very few people know how nutritious that grain is. You have to, you know, the Peruvians did a very good job of marketing quinoa. So you got to have these marketing skills to go into these specialty crops. But I would say that, you know, in the commodities future market that the Ethiopians created, the farmers know exactly what price they should get, so they're not cheated by the middleman. And that's what you would have to do in the Cameroons. And I don't think it's rocket science if the Ethiopians could create it, and I think there are other countries that have these commodity futures market. I think the Cameroonians can do it also. Now, so I would say, do your homework. Mushrooms is a very good crop. It's a high-value crop. Where are these mushrooms going? Would be my first question to you. Is it for the West or in the region? Is there a market? Do people eat mushrooms in that region?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then you should.
The unfortunate thing is we have it only once a year from late March to April.
Uh-huh.
It's gone.
Uh-huh.
So we want to be able to start cultivating it.
Yeah, I think there are different. Yes. There are different types of mushrooms, and from what I understand, you can grow them all year round. I don't know what type you're growing, but you may want to look into that, okay? Because they're very easy to grow and they grow fast. Yes. Okay, and then lastly, the question about the definition of sustainability. No fossil fuels, I don't know. I don't want to get into this definition of no chemical usage. Even in organic production, you can use chemicals up to a certain point, and then you got to cut it off. Very small, but you can use it. But how are you going to combat pests and diseases? I don't know. You can have an integrated pest management system. Yes. How effective that will be will depend on the science and the application of the procedures you need to put in place. But your question's a good one. I just don't know how I would go about answering that, and I dare not touch the question about Chinese men marrying. I have no idea. I really don't. But it is a problem, and and I don't know. Maybe somebody else who does social data could answer that question for you. Well, it could be. It could be, or it may not be. But I can tell you one thing: that having worked with China for over 20 years, the Chinese consider anybody who has one drop of Chinese blood Chinese. Yes, they're very different from other cultures. If you have one drop, that means they can ask you to do certain things for them.
On that note, let's join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. Very, very large topic, but I think we heard some great things around how the diaspora can be engaged, and you guys were a great audience and had some fantastic questions, so kept us all on our toes. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the Ron Brown series. Thanks.